Tune in weekly and listen to the Collateral Damage podcast, where Michael Wilson and Maureen Cavanaugh host a variety of special guests to discuss topics and available services that will help you learn about the impact that substance use has on our lives, our families, and on our communities nationwide. Episodes and listening information can be found at www.cdpodcast.com. You can also search for Collateral Damage Podcast on your favorite listening platforms or watch previous and future episodes on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Collateral Damage. My name is Mike Wilson. I'm here with my co-host, Maureen Cavanaugh. How you doing, Maureen?
I'm good, Mike. How are you?
Doing fantastic. And we have
I'm excited.
I am as well. Yeah, we have a special guest today, Ben Westhoff. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so, Ben, you are the author. You have multiple books out there, but you are the author of Fentanyl, Inc., which is the book that I most recently heard you talking about. And my understanding is this book came with a lot of research. Both ground research, traveling around as a journalist, trying to get information, as well as research into the fentanyl industry and how it was started and what it's doing to our country. And I'm just curious to hear maybe kind of how it started, why you decided to write a book like that, what led you down that path in the first place.
Well, this is the first book about fentanyl, and I had a friend who died from fentanyl in 2010. Back before anybody had really even heard of the drug.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's mostly being killed. People are mostly being killed by illicit fentanyl that is made in China. My friend, though, was killed by fentanyl patches.
Right.
And he had more than one on at the same time as he was drinking. And he kind of fell asleep face down on his pillow and suffocated. And
that's awful.
And when you talk about the opioid crisis, we hear so much about it, and fentanyl is the third wave. So prescription pills like OxyContin were the first wave, and then heroin was the second wave. And now, as a lot of your listeners probably know, it's really hard to find pure heroin in most parts of the U.S. It's all being cut with fentanyl. And so I kept hearing about fentanyl and wanted to know more. And so my book is a deep dive into the history about the Belgian chemist who created it, about how it sort of crossed over from the hospital pharmaceutical realm into the realm of recreational use and abuse. And I also infiltrated a pair of Chinese drug operations. I went to China and went inside a fentanyl lab, so I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
we're definitely going to talk about that.
That's an interesting story there. I mean, you brought up fentanyl being around, before, and I'm an addict in recovery and an opiate addict, and so, back when I was using, I mean, even early mid 2000s, we were getting the patches and the lollipops and all the different ways that fentanyl was prescribed back then, and abusing them in the background. I mean, even, trading them for other drugs and eating them, cutting the patches open and eating them, or just chewing on them like gum. And it was just as dangerous then. But like you said, with the illicit substances, I mean, now my understanding is that there's a good chance that fentanyl is in most of the things that you're using, any powder form of, either repressed Xanax, or cocaine or opiates, heroin. It's being mixed in with all that stuff now as a filler, a cheaper filler to add to the effect of the substance, or to create more of it so they can make more money in the sale.
Yeah, that's the sad truth, is that the drug landscape looks nothing like it did when we were young. And, they always told us that any drug could kill us, but now it's pretty much true.
Yeah, it's
in
real.
Terms of any pill or any powder could have fentanyl in it, and fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine, and it's the drug that most people don't ask for by name.
Right.
Instead, like you said, it's cut into heroin, but increasingly into cocaine, into meth, and into prescription pills.
Right.
Prince died when he thought he was taking a prescription opioid pill that was bought off the black market that was actually cut with fentanyl.
Yep.
And Tom Petty, as well as the rapper Mac Miller, both died that same way.
Yeah, I think I heard you tell a story about how Tom Petty stepped outside of a concert to looking for painkiller, right?
Yeah, he had a long history of addiction problems with opiates and opioids. And what I was told was that he injured himself at a concert and was looking for pain relief. And
Hmm.
he asked someone just on the street for pain pills. And it turns out that they were cut with fentanyl. So,
That's awful. I mean, you know, in my industry, so I work in the addiction industry. We work with families of addicts and alcoholics, and you know, everyone from teenagers right up and through adults. And you know, Maureen, you and I spoke about this the other day, that I've had
Yeah.
an influx of phone calls about 15-year-old kids and Xanax. You know, and you know, like you said before, the substance abuse landscape has changed so drastically that you know, back when I was a kid, the odds are that you were buying Xanax and you were buying it from somebody's prescription bottle, you know, a family member or
right.
somebody else, and you were getting Xanax, you were getting pharmaceutical grade Xanax. And now it's, you know, you've got 15-year-olds trying to buy it the same way, but the landscape has changed, and the people that are selling the Xanax
Yeah.
got
Well,
like a 50-50 chance of getting repressed fentanyl.
yeah, exactly. And so people buy a lot of these illicit drugs are made in China and processed in Mexico, but there's actually a lot of American drug dealers who buy these pill pressing machines from China,
Yeah.
and they're capable of making, thousands of pills an hour,
Hmm.
and they can be pressed to look pretty much exactly like a Xanax or a Vicodin or a OxyContin or whatever, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference.
That's terrifying.
And
I
they
mean,
have no sense of how much to put in that is going to kill somebody or not going to kill somebody, because
right.
they're not chemists. They're, drug dealers with a pill press.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's all sorts of hotspots. So it's from the same batch. You could get some pills that are pretty much benign, but other pills from the same batch that, kill
Mhm.
people.
Well, I mean, ecstasy was really big when I was in my mid 20s, and it still is now with Molly. And I know that also has a fairly odd mix of substances in it. But they used to call them disco biscuits when I was younger, and
Uh,
they were repressed, and you had a chance if you bought ecstasy. Some of it might be ecstasy, the other might be a pressed combination of opiates or heroin, crystal meth, and some aspirin or some cocaine, and it was just a disco biscuit. It had whatever they wanted to put in it, and some would be good, some would be strong, so on and so forth. And
yeah, or amphetamines. And that's how I originally came onto this story. Was I initially was going to write about ecstasy
mm-hmm.
and the electronic dance music scene. I was the LA Weekly music editor.
Yep.
And I was writing a story about how so many people were dying at raves,
Yeah.
because back in the day, I'm sure when you were on the scene, people took ecstasy, but you didn't hear as much about these deaths.
Right.
But
One or two every now and then. It wasn't
yeah,
extremely common.
but in the early part of this decade, it got to be so that every single rave you heard about someone dying, if not two or three people. And so
Right.
it turns out that there was almost no pure MDMA at all in these so-called ecstasy or Molly pills, and they were all adulterated with these new drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out all of these new drugs were synthetic. They were all made in a lab, and they were all sourced from China.
Wow.
And so that's how I kind of went down the rabbit hole to learn what these new drugs were. And that's how I first heard about fentanyl, which is the most dangerous of them all.
Yeah.
Mm.
So what made you decide? I mean, you spoke about this earlier, and I'm curious, and I know our listeners are too, to hear a little bit about this story. But I mean, I mean, you must be an investigative journalist to feel like you could take this trip. But what made you decide that you wanted to go to China and try to infiltrate this massive system out there of fentanyl production?
To really understand the story of fentanyl, you have to go to China, was my thinking, because
Yeah.
it's all made there, and it was all being sold really flagrantly.
Yeah.
You could just Google buy fentanyl in China, and there would be hundreds of different companies that would come up on the search engine. And so I just began emailing salespeople at these companies because they had their email addresses right there on the website. And
Wow.
I made a fake email address. I said I was a drug dealer, and I asked if I could visit their operation if I came to China, and they said yes. And so
Wow.
so then I went in early 2018. I went to two places. One was a traditional lab outside of Shanghai,
Mm-hmm.
and I met the owner of the lab at the train station, and he spent most of the day, the first part of the day, kind of sizing me up. And I told him this story that I wasn't actually a drug dealer. It was my friend who was a drug dealer.
Yeah.
And I just happened to be in China. And if I was able to see his lab and it passed muster with our quality control standards, then my friend would be willing to make big buys from this guy on a regular basis. And so finally he let me go, decided to take me there. He called his driver. We drove way out to the middle of nowhere.
Must have been
I didn't
terrifying.
have like GPS functioning. You can't use your own cell phone in China.
Oh, wow.
So you have to rent one basically from the government. So it was not, I didn't have good GPS or anything. And we saw the lab, and it wasn't some sort of underground bunker. It was basically in a kind of suburban office park.
Okay.
There was a fountain out front, and it looked like it could have been any sort of legitimate business inside of there. And there were this industrial sized glassware, it made me think of the show Breaking Bad. And very strong chemical smell.
Yeah.
And these drugs were just piled high. They were making two main things. They were making fentanyl analogs, which are basically different types of fentanyl where the chemical structure has just been slightly tweaked.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, they're just as potent as fentanyl. Sometimes they're a lot more potent than fentanyl. And the other thing they were making in this lab was synthetic cannabinoids, which your listeners may know of, like K2 and spice.
Yeah.
Those are two examples.
And that's just a chemical, right? That they spray onto another substance, like a potpourri or any other leafy product or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like dried sage, any dried plant matter. And it's intended, it can be smoked like marijuana. You could smoke it out of a joint or a pipe, but it really has nothing in common with marijuana.
Okay.
It's not a relaxing drug. It like makes your heart race. People overdose and die in it a lot, but it's very popular because it can't be detected by most drug tests.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah, they keep changing the chemical. Like we actually can test for K2?
Yeah, well, but the thing is
chemical.
K2, it doesn't even mean one thing. You know what I mean? It's like that doesn't refer to a specific chemical. So something that's sold as K2 one week might have a completely different chemical the next time it's sold.
Right.
So there's literally, you're right. They keep changing it. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. And people smoke them when they have drug tests most often. So this lab specialized in these fentanyl analogs and the synthetic cannabinoids, and they were making them in huge quantities. And, I had my phone recording secretly in my breast pocket, and I just, I kind of described what I saw all around me.
Yeah.
And the language barrier was enough that they didn't wonder why this crazy person was speaking out loud into the air for no reason.
Yeah.
And
like, look at this big pile of orange powder over here.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the kind of stuff I was saying. And
that must have been terrifying, though, because you really, I know it looked like a normal office park, but, they're breaking their own law, too, I would assume.
Well, that's the thing about this company.
I'm afraid to ask.
Like it. Yeah. Well, they actually specialized in chemicals that were legal in China. And so that's how they can operate so flagrantly is all of these chemicals were banned in the US and other Western countries, but they're still legal in China. And so this company specialized in this sort of narrow window when a new designer drug or a novel psychoactive substance, as they're called, like all these ones I've been describing, when they're popularized on the internet, but they're still legal in China.
So they're legal in China, but are people in China using them, or they're just really exporting them?
Yeah, it's pretty much just for export. Fentanyl is not a big drug of abuse in China at all. And so that's why a lot of people have accused China of not cracking down on this industry, because they say China doesn't care as much because it's not affecting Chinese citizens.
Right. Well, it's very possible. It's just money for them, right?
Yeah. Well, it's since become part of Trump's trade war. And So in more recently, China has banned all of these different types of fentanyl analogs. And Trump has said if they don't stop the export to the US, that he's going to increase different trade duties and tariffs and things like that on other products. So
Right.
it's finally getting some international attention, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be enough to slow the crisis here anytime too soon.
Wow. And so were you, I mean, were you nervous? Were you scared? I mean, I imagine that if you got caught or if they found out that you were who you were instead of who you said you were, that they might have challenged that, right?
Yeah, I was definitely nervous. I was nervous when I got in the car with this guy and he had this big driver, this big kind of muscled, beefy dude who didn't speak English. And I thought, if they find out I'm a journalist, this is the guy who's going to break my kneecaps or whatever.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I was more afraid about the Chinese government
Yeah.
because I wasn't there on an official journalist visa. I
Okay.
was there on a tourist visa because I knew they wouldn't let me do what I wanted to do if I went on a journalist visa. And so
Yeah.
I could have been thrown in jail
Wow.
for that alone. So
Wow. Well, I mean, I gotta say, just that, like I said, just taking that risk in itself was very courageous. I mean, to get the story and to get the inside details, that's huge.
right, yeah. The other thing that made me a little less afraid was these aren't like the Colombian cartels or the Mexican cartels. They're
Yeah.
not violent. These are business people, these
Mm-hmm.
people running these Chinese labs. They, like I said, they want to play by the letter of the law and they want to make money. They don't want to ruffle feathers. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's also really strict gun control in China. So there's not a lot of guns there. So,
Hmm.
I took a little bit of comfort in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Still terrifying, but yes.
Yeah.
And so this information that you brought back, I mean, you had the opportunity, obviously, to put it into a book and to get this information out there. But you use this information to testify as well at a congressional hearing, right? And what was the motivation behind that? Were you asked? Were you pushed into it?
Yeah, yeah, I was asked. There's been a lot of interest from the government about the findings in my book, Fentanyl Inc., because not only did I sort of uncover what's happening in the industry that's exporting this fentanyl, but the Chinese government itself is largely complicit in promoting this industry. So I found out that companies who export fentanyl actually get big tax breaks.
Oh wow.
They're known
my
as value-added tax breaks, and they also receive all sorts of subsidies from the government.
Wow.
They're like biotech companies basically, and most of them make other drugs besides dangerous drugs like fentanyl. They also make legitimate drugs,
Mhm.
legitimate chemicals, and pharmaceuticals. And so the government rewards them with these big incentives, often for like training and development, for land subsidies on rent. They're in these like business development parks,
Mhm.
and the government either doesn't know or doesn't care that they're producing all these fentanyl products on the side. And so
Wow.
I spoke with a commission on Capitol Hill, and I've since consulted with leaders from the U.S. House and Senate and the State Department, and everyone is sort of shocked that China is so brazenly encouraging this industry, and they want to know what can be done to stop it.
Well, I mean, the conspiracy theorist in me thinks about pharmaceutical warfare, chemical warfare, just kind of injecting this product into the United States. We are the number one consumer for drugs in the world. I mean, when people make drugs in other countries, they're like, boy, Americans are going to love this, and so it's not a surprise that another country would do that. I don't know if it's malicious or if it's intentional, but it sounds like it might be.
Yeah, a lot of people describe this as a reverse opium war.
Yeah.
And so in the early 19th century, China fought a pair of opium wars with England, who was supplying the country with these huge quantities of opium, and Chinese citizens were getting addicted and
Mhm.
at huge rates. And so China went to war to stop them, and they ended up losing. And the spoils of that defeat were the Hong Kong was given to England.
Mhm.
So now people call this a reverse opium war, because now it's China who's supplying an opioid to the West.
Yeah.
And the conspiracy theorists have also been fueled by there's like a US Army white paper that quotes these Chinese generals talking about different forms, like you were saying, of warfare. And one of them they discuss is through drugs warfare.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
Destabilize a country.
Yeah.
You can destabilize a country with drugs like this. You know, you can change the focus of what a country's government will pay attention to and where they'll put their money. And, you know, I mean, it's devastating. You know?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I don't think it started out this way. I think the Chinese government was legitimately trying to develop its chemical exports to grow its economy.
Yeah.
And that's the basis for these all these different subsidies. But now it's gotten to the point where everybody knows what's going on. The US is in the midst of this horrible opioid crisis. And so that's when it begins to really make you wonder.
Well, it's not, I mean, the opioid crisis, of course, is definitely the thing that people are talking about and paying attention to because it's taking lives. But there's also this drive to find other substances too, the chemicals, you know, I mean, kratom's come around real big now. You know, there was a fight recently, maybe last year, to criminalize it, and it I guess they lost because it's not illegal now. They were trying to make it a scheduled drug, and now it's just still not. People are out there using that. There's other substances I know up in Maine, up in Lewiston. They had a lot of Somalians came up there quite a few years ago, and they brought with them a root, cat root.
Yeah. It's a class of drug known as cathinone.
Yep.
And another one of these novel psychoactive substances, these new types of designer drugs, are all these synthetic cathinones.
Yeah.
So they're intended to replicate the effect of the natural cat plant, and they're most famous as bath salts.
Okay.
Okay.
And so, yeah, a lot of people were talking about those, especially a few years ago, and it's a misnomer. These are little packets that are labeled as bath salts or potpourri or incense, and on the back they say not intended for human consumption.
Right.
And that's intended to get around the law. But, you know, they're not really salts for your bath or incense or whatever. They're these chemicals, in this case, usually synthetic cathinones that are sprayed onto plant matter. Okay. And, you know, it's a wide range. Some of these synthetic cathinones are totally safe. Some will make you lose your head. But the biggest problem is that nobody knows the proper dosage. So you can get one packet that has just a tiny trace amounts of the chemical and another that has huge quantities. And, you know, it's the same problem with fentanyl.
Right.
And that's the problem with these new drugs that I talk about in my book, that you keep going back to over and over, which is the old saying in toxicology, the dose makes the poison. Not the drug itself. It's the fact that no one knows how much to be taking.
Yeah.
So Ben, I think people will read this book and they will be like shocked, like things are coming at you, like you can't believe half of the stuff in the book. Unfortunately it's true, but you can't believe that this stuff is going on. Was there anything when you were doing the research for the book or putting the book together that you thought, I can't believe this, like something that really surprised or shocked you?
Yeah. I think what is really strange is that almost all of these new drugs, including fentanyl, were all created in legitimate labs by medical scientists who were hoping to make drugs to benefit humanity. And so when I heard about new drugs, I always thought it was some evil mad scientist in a laboratory, like cooking up drugs to poison people, but it's not like that at all. What happened was a lot of these drugs that are just becoming popular now were created decades ago. And they were made by university scientists who were trying to create new medicine to patent and hopefully sell. And so in a lot of these cases, they created the drug, they published a paper about it, but then nothing ever happened. And those papers just kind of sat on dusty university shelves. But in the internet age, all of these papers started to be put online. And so now anyone with an internet connection could browse through the archives and find out this whole like vast treasure trove of drug formulas, basically like recipes to make all these new drugs. And so it's only been in the last 2 decades that these drugs are all coming to life now, and in some cases killing thousands of people for with a drug that only existed on paper, you know, until not that long ago.
Wow.
Well, ecstasy, MDMA was, I remember watching something that back in maybe the 60s or 70s that it was used as in marriage therapy to kind of reinitiate the intimacy of marriage, and before it was made a scheduled drug. You know, it had a therapeutic value. There was intention behind it. You know, the same could be said for some other substances. You know, I know that, was it mushrooms now, psilocybin, they're using therapeutically for end of life. You know, for some folks that are facing the end of life scenario, they're microdosing psilocybin to help people get comfortable with the possibility of death. You know, they do have some medicinal purpose if they're used, like you said, the dose makes the poison. If it's used correctly by the right people, it might have a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, luckily there's been somewhat of a sea change, and a lot of these, especially psychedelics, are being given permission to do testing with them. And so LSD is another one. You know, there's a lot of testing to help people stop smoking, you
Really?
know,
Wow.
alcoholism, other drugs. And MDMA, the drug in ecstasy, has shown to be particularly valuable in helping people recover from PTSD.
Oh, wow.
You know, in some cases, people with PTSD will do one round of this therapy with MDMA, take it one time, and their symptoms are so reduced that they no longer are considered to have PTSD.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I've never heard that.
Hmm.
I know ketamine is also Special K, which
Yeah.
is a club drug from back in the day, is also, ketamine's being used to treat depression in some situations as well now. I think, and again, all of these things may have some medicinal uses, but you know, on the street when you're purchasing them at a club, at a rave,
Right.
or you know, from a friend, you don't know what
You
you're
don't know
getting.
what you're getting.
You
And
should-
yeah, controlled environment and the doses are, you know,
yeah.
monitored, and we know what we're getting. It's a different story.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other problem with these new drugs, these novel psychoactive substances, is that for every known drug that you've heard of, there's a new synthetic version that's being sold as that drug often. So for heroin, you know, heroin is a natural drug that comes from a plant. Now there's fentanyl, which is synthetic and much more powerful. You know, same with marijuana, natural drug. It's a very safe history. No one's ever overdosed and died from marijuana. But now there's the new synthetic version of marijuana,
Right.
K2 and spice. And so it's the same way with stuff like LSD too. LSD is another drug where no one has ever died from an overdose from the drug.
Right.
But there are these new versions of LSD. They don't have anything in common chemically with LSD, but the effects can be similar. The only problem is that these new versions can and do kill people.
Yeah.
So that's another reason this landscape is so dangerous right now.
Well, and I mean, I'm grateful that I'm in recovery. I've been in recovery for about 10 years, and you know, the landscape just over the last 10 years has changed. You know, being in the industry, I'm watching what's coming through the door, and you know, when I smoked pot before, that's what we were doing. We were smoking pot. We were smoking marijuana. You know, we were getting the plant, we were getting the flower. You know, maybe we got something that was 25, 30% THC, and that was really good, and we paid a lot of money for it, and it was coveted. You know, now it's rare. You know, most of the kids are smoking either the dab or the oil or some tincture or something that has anywhere from 80 to 100% THC value, which is devastating to an adolescent, and actually has psychoactive, like hallucinogenic effects. They call it weed crack, just kind of boiling it down to its purest form.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound fun. Well,
No.
I don't want to encourage people to smoke marijuana, especially like teenagers and people who using it heavily when their brains aren't fully developed.
Hmm.
But you know, marijuana, if you can see the buds, if you can smell them,
Hmm.
you can be pretty sure that's not going to be laced with fentanyl.
Correct.
There isn't that financial incentive for drug dealers to put fentanyl on weed. And so, if you have to do it, if you want to do a drug these days, I would say if you can get some real marijuana with the flowers and everything, that's probably your best bet.
Well, it's the safest one. My understanding is, and Maureen, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was some recent buzz on the internet, maybe in the last few months, where people were putting out this fear campaign
Yeah.
about marijuana being laced with fentanyl. But the flashpoint for fentanyl is that it burns
The,
off.
the burn
You
the
can't
burn rate,
smoke
you
it.
can't do that. It's not
Yeah.
possible. So
That's a good point.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
a lot of these it's a lot of these misconceptions and people trying to I don't know what it is. It's all part of the stigma of
Mhm.
and talking about how one speck of fentanyl on somebody's shoulder caused them to overdose. I mean, things that aren't true, but that's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another misconception, is that you can overdose just by touching fentanyl, and that's not true. I think it's so important to get good, accurate information out there,
Yes,
because if kids, if you lie to them about one thing, they're going to
Right.
assume you're lying to them about everything.
That's right.
absolutely. Well, not only that, but I mean, this is the fear like that makes people afraid to Narcan somebody, afraid to call for
Yeah.
help, and so we I think it's really important that we let people know what's true and what's not true about this. The synthetics terrify me though,
Yeah.
because we can't even test for them. So you have, parents and people that are testing their children, or even treatment centers and sober living, they're testing to see if somebody is testing positive for a drug, so they can either get them back into treatment or help them in some way. And there's no way of testing for a lot of these drugs.
Yeah, yeah, there isn't, and that the drug checking is another really critical part too, to see if what you have is what you think you have, or
Right.
there's, say, fentanyl in it. And in that regard, there is the technology is evolving pretty fast.
Well,
In
that's been
fentanyl,
available in Europe forever. The
yeah.
drug test, the safety testing. It's
So important.
not so
So
much here
important.
though, right?
Well, I write in the book. I write about this company called Bunk Police, and they
Hmm.
have developed some really sophisticated and really inexpensive kits.
Okay.
Fentanyl testing strips are only like $2, and they function kind of like a pregnancy test.
Yep.
It's like a paper strip. You dip it in a solution of your drugs, and if there's one stripe, then there's fentanyl. If there's two stripes, there's not. But Bunk Police, for example, sells these kits that you can test, like, for this whole, hundreds of different drugs. And if you've got something, um, I would just suggest testing it,
Right.
just to be safe.
Right, because the reality is people are going to use these drugs, so they should know what they're using at least, and give them
Right.
a fighting chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is, in places like Pennsylvania, fentanyl testing strips are still illegal. They're still banned, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Although now,
That we're banning, right? Well, we have
Yeah.
all this
Yeah,
other stuff going on, and we're worried about the testing strips.
Yeah.
right. But now there's a movement to legalize them, and also in Philadelphia is trying to have the country's first medication supervised injection facility,
Right.
where people can legally use drugs. Maybe you guys may have talked about that
Mhm.
issue here.
Yeah, it's a bit of a battle. I know that there's both sides of that. Why are we giving them a safe place to do it? And then they're going to do it anyway. Why not give them a safe place to do it so they can stay alive long enough to get the help? And that's, they're again basing that off of European models and even Canada. I think we had a guest on that was talking
Vancouver,
about
yeah.
the Vancouver. And these are great ideas to keep people alive. They are reactions. They are responses to an epidemic that nobody has a solution for. And so on a big picture scale, it's like, what do we actually do about it? We react, we respond, we create ways to keep people alive while they're struggling with it. But of course, none of these are solutions to the problem. I mean, we've got a country full of people who are looking for relief, and they're going to find it one way or another, be it through substances, gambling, eating, working, whatever. It's just that substances
Yeah.
are easy
Well,
to get.
yeah. Well, for Fentanyl Inc., I went to Barcelona, Spain, and they
Okay.
have a bunch of these supervised injection facilities there.
Hmm.
And the benefits are twofold. For the addicted users, it's a spot where they can go, and there are doctors and nurses present. There are
Mhm.
clean needles. They have access to all this different treatment. They become part of a community. They
Yep.
become part of the system, and they've never had someone die at one of these facilities anywhere in the world. But the other benefit is it helps the community at large. And so Barcelona in particular had this problem with discarded syringes,
Yep.
in public parks and places like that. And since they've opened these supervised injection facilities, the rates of discarded syringes have dropped way down. There's a much lower rate of HIV and other infectious diseases. And, a lot of even police chiefs in Europe have said that these facilities really help them do their job of reducing crime, because if people are brought into the system, they're less likely to have to rob and steal and do prostitution, for
Right.
example, to pay for their habits.
Now, are those the 3-tier models? The safe injection site downstairs, and then they've got like outpatient and then residential, so you can kind of, as you're showing up on a regular basis, you can be integrated into the treatment model there.
That might be in Vancouver, maybe.
Okay.
They didn't have it at the one I saw in Barcelona, but I have
Okay.
heard about that. Yeah.
I think
Mhm.
that is Portugal. Portugal does that too, right? They
Yeah.
have. I think that
Yeah.
was in Portugal that
Okay.
they've actually implemented, not just the safe injection site. Like their country did it the right way, which was they decriminalized and they declared it a public health emergency, and they funneled all their money toward it being a public health issue. So instead of all the money going toward like the DEA and prison industry, it's all going toward the health of it. And so they created these multi-tiered safe injection sites / treatment programs where people can start at the ground level of, hey, I'm just here to do my drugs safely, to, oh, well, I've seen you here a few weeks now, do you want to talk about some treatment? And so you've got constant contact with these people, and that you have access to different levels, different tiers of treatment if you keep coming. And
Yeah.
that's been a huge
That's
success out
very
there.
cool. Yeah.
Yep.
But they did it right. I mean, our country, we'd have to get all 50 states to agree that this is a public health issue and start, deferring our funds from the prohibitionary stance of let's keep it out of the country to let's address the issue why it's happening. Let's treat the public health side. Then let's get safe injection sites everywhere. Then let's treat them like people with a health issue. I mean, I assume that would take a bit of work.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, the presidential candidate Andrew Yang has talked about
Hmm.
decriminalizing opioids,
Yeah.
and that at first I didn't really know what to make of that. It sounded like a bridge too far, but
Yeah.
I'm beginning to think that the problem is just people aren't getting treatment when they're being locked up, and
No.
this there's been a movement towards medication assisted treatment in the US in large part,
Hmm.
but it can't just be handing out Suboxone to people and then forgetting about them. It
Right.
has to be in combination with therapy, counseling, helping people get their lives together,
Hmm.
because that's as much about the cycle of addiction as the drugs and their chemical hooks.
Right.
There was actually a movement roughly 10 years or so ago when I started my company. I remember I went to a Kiwanis meeting, and I was joining Kiwanis in my local town, and they had this gentleman that was speaking, and he was a retired FBI agent, and he was part of a large group of industry professionals, DEA, FBI, folks like that who'd been fighting the war on drugs for a long time, and they were collaborating. They were getting together, and they were pushing for legalization / decriminalization of all the drugs, saying that the war that they were fighting was a futile effort. They were basically, every time that they put a block in place, the people who wanted it would find a way to go around it. So it was we were fighting the supply instead of the demand. you know, and since the demand exists, they will always find a way to get it. They'll always find a synthetic or another alternative to it. And we weren't treating the actual problem, which is why do people demand the substances? Why is the United States the #1 consumer in the world for all the substances made everywhere else? And it was interesting. In the beginning of my recovery, I was like, that's insane. Absolutely not. I couldn't imagine that. But over the last 10 years or so, I've started to be like, maybe maybe that's better than what we've been doing for however many decades we've been trying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big argument in favor of decriminalization and legalization, is that the drug cartels, you know, in Mexico, it's gotten to up to something like 30,000 murders a year.
Wow.
And you're basically, by keeping these drugs illegal, you're enriching the cartels. There's no other real way to look at it. And
Hmm.
it's not just people in the US who are dying from drug overdoses, it's people who are dying in other countries because of the illegal drug trade. And
Mhm.
you know, one of my big messages in the book is that the war on drugs has been, you know, floundering for decades, and the DEA helped kill Pablo Escobar,
Hmm.
and this was supposed to make a dent in the Colombian cocaine trade. But nowadays, Colombia sends more cocaine out to the world than it ever did previously.
Yeah.
You know, El Chapo was locked up and tried, and that hasn't done anything to slow the drug trade from Mexico.
Right.
And now, you know, the China issue is one that's starting to consume people. But if even if we can tamp down on China and get them to control their drug trade, the industry will likely just migrate to a place like India,
Yeah.
where fentanyl production is already starting to happen. So,
Well, Afghanistan was the heroin import. You know, I mean, that's the thing is, I guess if you look at, we have a demand. That's the issue. We have a demand for it. There are people who want it and people who need it, and it doesn't matter where the supply comes from. I mean, they will shut down one chemical, another chemical will come up. It's that pursuit of relief, that pursuit of you know, self-soothing in the form of a pill or a powder or whatever it might be. And I guess that's the battle that we're up against. I mean, Maureen and I are both working in this industry, you know, with a variety of different people coming through, and they all have that demand. Might be different substances, but they all have that demand. And you know, you look at prohibition back in, what was it, the 20s with alcohol. I mean, that was, the mob was born, right? The what they call the moonshiners. Who were the ones that, yeah, they would just, you know, drive around, and I mean, they're making alcohol in the woods, you know, in these stills, and it was like, okay, we can't have it. Well, we still want it, so we're just going to make it and find another way to do it, and you just made other people rich.
yeah, and another thing, people like Mitchell Gomez and Emmanuel Severios, who both worked with Dance Safe. Another argument in favor of decriminalization and legalization is that during these prohibitionary times, like the prohibition of alcohol, it becomes more efficient and cost effective to make the drugs and more potent. So people didn't want to be, you know, the mob didn't want to be shipping around all these giant containers of beer. They instead were making moonshine and other hard liquor in bathtubs and things like that. Is much more dangerous. And now
Yeah.
we're seeing the same thing in the synthetics era. The Mexican cartels are switching over from heroin to fentanyl
Hmm.
as fast as they can, because it's so much easier to distribute it up through the U.S. border, because it's such, you know, 50 kilos of heroin is equivalent to just 1 kilo of fentanyl.
Right.
So it's so much easier to distribute.
Well, if you think about this, right, here's some funny numbers that people really don't consider, is that, you know, we're talking about drugs that are killing people all over the place. You know, we're talking about fentanyl, heroin, crack, crystal meth, stuff like that. But if you consider it, the two substances that actually kill more people every year are cigarettes and alcohol. Cigarettes, matter of fact, kill more people than alcohol and drugs combined, and alcohol kills more people than all other drugs combined, not including cigarettes. They're both legal. They're both regulated. And I can tell you right now that if I went to try to buy alcohol or cigarettes off my friends, they'd just be like, we'll just go to the store. Like, there's nobody out there bootlegging it. There's nobody out there
Yeah.
selling it in that capacity. So it doesn't stop people from using it, but it did regulate the market, and it did stop the, you know, the underground sale and the young entrepreneurs. Like, I don't know any high school kids that are going around buying cartons of cigarettes and selling them in the back.
Yeah, I mean, the cigarettes seems like an example of a public health story that had a happy ending.
Right.
You know, they everybody knows that if you outlaw cigarettes, you're just going to enable this black market trade. But by taxing it at the appropriate level and
Hmm.
using profits from cigarettes to help defer health costs, there's we've been able to drive down the rate of cigarette usage,
Yeah.
while at the same time having funding for care related to it. So it seems like there should be that happy medium when it comes to other drugs too.
It's just a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard pill for people. It's even hard for me. I'm here talking about it. It might even sound like I am pro legalization or decriminalization. And it's just, I'm confused. I don't know what
Yeah,
the solution is. I just know that, 50 years of what we've been doing hasn't helped.
Yeah.
right.
Like generationally, you'd think that, oh, we should be weeding this out by now. We killed this guy. We captured that guy. We blocked this path. We blocked that path. I mean, aside from just putting a bubble over the United States and being like, all right, we don't import anything anymore. Someone will tunnel out.
Yeah,
Somebody will create a way. So it's just, I'm confused.
So,
yeah,
but
and it is confusing. There's Maureen, did you want to
no,
say?
I was just going to say, knowing everything that you know now, I mean, you have a tremendous amount of knowledge on this subject. What do you think we should change? What should be a couple of first steps, at least, things that we're not doing now?
Yeah, well, there's some pretty obvious first steps in the U.S. For example, we have to legalize fentanyl testing strips,
I can't
all over
believe
the
that.
country. That's
Yeah,
that's a no-brainer.
Hmm.
We have to get rid of things like the Rave Act, which is this piece of kind of obscure legislation that makes it illegal, basically, for concert promoters and rave promoters to allow drug checking on site,
Wow.
because it's tantamount to admitting they know drug use is taking place on the premises. It's ridiculous. We need better access and funding for medication-assisted treatment, more Narcan availability. Narcan should be available to everybody
Hmm.
who needs it. There's I'm an advocate for supervised injection facilities, and even though this one in Philadelphia, the courts have ruled in its favor, but there still are none that are operating legally in the US.
Right.
right.
I'm not saying that, supervised injection facilities are a panacea. You've heard about in Vancouver where they have a number of them, and fentanyl death rates are actually still rising there.
Yeah.
And so these facilities are controversial even in Vancouver. But again, it comes down to just what you were saying, that we've been doing it the wrong way for so long. We might as well try something else.
Yeah.
So,
It's hard. I mean, I think that, you look at Narcan just all in itself. I mean, we got AEDs all over the place. Somebody has a heart attack or somebody goes out. I just recently did the first aid CPR. That's why this popped in my head. They're like, there's actually an app that I can go on and I can find my local AED. I can just click it and it will pull up my location and tell me where there's an AED somewhere so that I can save someone's life. And, I mean, a simple thing would be every AED should also have a Narcan kit, like that, you can find one, or that people should carry them. An obvious solution, but it's just a reaction. These are
Right.
all responses to an epidemic that we don't have a solution to. And, I mean, every guest that we have on, we always ask, if you could change something, what would you change? And we get a lot of answers, but it's always that the thing we have to change is so big, it might not change.
yeah,
That's the scariest part of the answer, is that, at least in me, the consensus I'm getting is that the answers seem so big that it's like, who could do it? Is the government going to step in and do it for us? Can they save us? Or do we as a community have to start speaking up and publicly saying, like, our country is dying? What do we need to
yeah.
do differently?
Well, I think, forums like this are the first step, because when it comes to new drugs like fentanyl, there really is an education gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least with drugs like heroin and crack and meth, those people who take it are intending to take those drugs.
True.
Fentanyl, a lot of people still haven't even heard of, and a lot of people who overdose and die don't even know they were taking fentanyl.
Right.
Right.
That's very true.
So,
Well, it's we have testing here in Massachusetts, and it's still not even CLA waived. Like, we have test cups that test for fentanyl now, but it's not admissible. Like, you can't actually use it as a legal result on a test now.
Oh,
We can
interesting.
still test for it, but you just can't use it for anything. I just think that's weird. I don't know. I mean, I'm actually seeing more people who are buying fentanyl intentionally now over the last two
Yeah.
years, where they're buying it because it's cheaper, it's more potent, and it doesn't show up in a lot of the tests that it show. And even when it does, it's out faster. It can be out of your system in 8 to 12 hours, and it's no longer showing up in a test.
Oh wow, I didn't know it was that fast.
Yeah, we have, we have a men's sober living, and we have to, if we suspect someone of fentanyl, we have to get on top of it really fast, because we won't, 24 hours later, it could be out of their system as far as the test that we have. And even then, it's just crazy that they're buying it intentionally now.
Yeah, well, in St. Louis too, where I live, fentanyl is being sold as fentanyl,
Yeah,
and in places like San Francisco. And then I was talking to some guys in Vancouver. They were saying the stuff being sold on the street is almost exclusively fentanyl. That
right.
no one's even
Yeah.
offering heroin anymore.
Yeah,
And
heroin's old school. Nobody wants
Yeah, I
that
think that's
anymore.
fairly true here in the Northeast in Massachusetts. It's almost all fentanyl now. I don't think that there's a whole lot of heroin here.
Which just speaks to the need for the product. Again, the demand. Now the demand is there. It was the demand from the
Right.
dealers to, to manipulate the customer.
mm,
And now the demand is from the customer, and the dealers have no choice because the dealers who would sell heroin are now getting asked for fentanyl.
What did you
yeah, it's like
say?
an arms race.
Yeah,
It's
Yeah.
that with heroin, a lot of addicted users, they don't get high anymore. They just get eased off their withdrawal symptoms. But
yeah,
fentanyl will get people high again, and then once you're used to a fentanyl high, there's
yeah,
no going back.
right. Yeah, the evolution of substance use is just disgusting. Watching it from the sidelines and watching the people that are struggling with it. I mean, Maureen, you see this all day too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's devastating to the
Yeah.
families.
Yeah.
The families who, they don't understand this product either. They don't understand why it's so available. Why their loved ones are doing it. It's just such a confusing illness. And I think you wrote some stuff in your book about some of the things that you think should change in those harm reduction models. The MAT. That's another confusing thing for people. That we were talking about Portugal, and there was a documentary on HBO, and I think that's where I learned most of what I learned about that. I haven't actually been to Portugal, but in watching that, there was this one gentleman, and he stuck out to me, where they interviewed him, and he was a heroin user, and he was an older gentleman, probably in his late 40s, 50s. And they asked him about his response to the safe injection site / treatment center that was there. And his comment kind of surprised me. He said, I feel like they've just forgotten about me, because he was being prescribed a medication, and because he was no longer a threat to the community, there was no interaction with people. They just he just went and got his daily dose of heroin, because they use HAT over there, not MAT. He just got his daily dose of heroin, and then he went about his business. And he's like, I feel like people are just happy that I'm not committing crimes anymore. Like, there was no intention to help him. And I feel like here in the States, we get a lot of that too, where people are maybe put on MAT, like you were saying earlier, and there's no additional treatment to address the issue. It's just, okay, now you're stable. Now you're a
Yeah,
stable, suffering addict. Good luck. Instead of, okay, now that you're stable, let's do more. Let's treat the illness about what got you here in the first place. And that's confusing for families, because they see the lack of chaos, and they're like, oh, this is progress. Well, it's just the
yeah.
first step. There's got to be more.
Yeah.
Well,
And
my wife, for example, is really big into abstinence-based treatment, and
yeah,
it's controversial, but for a lot of people, a spiritual-based recovery can be really effective, and there's
hmm,
even like there's academic literature that shows this. And if you're you know if there's a cause that's bigger than yourself,
yep.
it can really help people get through it.
Well, that's what I went through, was the steps. That's abstinence based, and so was our house, and so are most of my colleagues. But it's still, I was abstinence based before fentanyl. I was abstinence
Right.
based before, Suboxone was such a huge thing. And, I know methadone's been around forever, but it was the only one for me. I tried everything to quit except quitting. Um, and so
What
when I
did I
finally
read
did,
the
it
other?
worked.
I read the other day. If you watching your child go through a heroin addiction or a drug addiction, the question will change from how do I make them stop to how do I keep them alive. I mean, and people can't get well unless they stay breathing, right? So I think whatever works for the person. I mean, I'm a big fan of Vivitrol
Yep.
because there's no opioid in it, and I think that's the perfect combination, is to try to stave off that while you work on yourself. But that's the whole problem, is people are not, continuing like that 12-step program and that for a little while until you can stop. That would be awesome, or therapy or whatever. But you have to get at the root of why this started to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will ask you the same question that we ask everybody, Ben. I know that you offered up a couple things that you think we could change, but is there anything new that you think we could introduce to the situation that might help address this, the epidemic that our country's facing?
Well, I think, we talked about decriminalization and also, maybe mandatory treatment as an alternative to putting people in jail. And
Yeah.
I think the recidivism rate is such a big problem, and know a lot of people here in St. Louis who have gone into jail or prison with drug problems, and then they get out and it's as if they were never gone. The
Right.
problem resurfaces almost immediately. And so, again, this is not to say that I believe this will be a panacea, but treating it like a problem, like a disease, seems like it's worth a try at the very least. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, treating it like the illness that it is instead of, a crime is huge. I mean, we got an overcrowded prison system, a privatized prison industry full of people who absolutely need treatment, not punishment. So,
and there's very little of these opioid blockers or Suboxone or methadone or whatever in prison, but people can still get drugs in prison, and so oftentimes people can't even dry out in that environment.
Right. Well, I would love to give you an opportunity. You have a bunch of books out there, and I'd love for our listeners and viewers to get a chance to check them out. So Fentanyl Inc. is the most recent book that's come out. I believe you're going to have a new book coming out soon as well, right?
Oh,
Not
no,
on this topic, but...
that one I've just sort of started writing.
Oh,
but,
okay, all right.
But yeah, no, Fentanyl Inc., How Rogue Chemists Are Creating the Deadliest Wave of the Opioid Epidemic.
Okay.
That has my, infiltration of the Chinese drug labs and the history of fentanyl and novel psychoactive substances. That just came out a few months ago.
And that's available everywhere, right? Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores.
And it's like been winning best book of 2019 and all kinds of great reviews. And I just think that everybody should read this, because people have no idea what's going on behind the scenes with all these synthetics and with fentanyl. And I think this book is just packed full of information that people need to know.
Agreed.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I also have 2 books about hip hop music. One is about Southern rap called Dirty South, and the other is about NWA and Tupac. It's called Original Gangsters. Okay. Basically like the true story behind the Straight Outta Compton movie. But yeah, the subject matters are different, but at heart I'm, an investigative reporter. So I kind of treat and with the focus on like storytelling and narrative and personal stories. And so, these rappers I wrote about, I got to interview Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Ice Cube and all them. And their stories are just so compelling, what they went through. And
that's interesting.
Ultimately, it's these human stories that I try to tell in my books.
So you were the music critic at the LA Times?
At the LA Weekly. Yeah.
LA Weekly. What do you listen to now?
What do I listen to now? I really like the new Lana Del Rey album.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard that yet. I like her.
Yeah, it's really good. I still like the old school hip hop. Is the stuff you go. I feel like the stuff you listen to in high school is the stuff that sticks with you the rest of your life. Often.
Absolutely. Can I ask you a question about the Dirty South one? Just because of the topic that we're into here, did lean come into that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. That's also known as scissor. It's basically promethazine, codeine, cough syrup and it's usually mixed in like a 2-liter soda bottle.
Yeah.
And has been especially popular in Houston.
Yep.
And really influenced the hip hop scene coming out of there. And there's rappers like UGK, a rap duo, and one of their members, Pimp C, died actually from drinking lean. And it's, the sound there in Houston, it's really slow. It's
Twisted and Screwed, right?
Yeah, the Chopped and Screwed, exactly.
Chopped and Screwed, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and that's heavily influenced by lean.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually that's come out here too, out to the East Coast, and that younger generation of new rappers. Everybody, is they're rapping about lean, they're talking about lean, and it's become a lot more mainstream. And now the kids are mixing the lean and Adderall, and lean and Xanax, and just putting it in Sprite bottles, shaking it up, and going about their business.
It's really dangerous. I mean, lean is an opioid too, right? And especially when you're mixing it with something like Xanax, a benzodiazepam, that's one of the most fatal combinations you can have. They both slow your heart rate way down. And
well, it's a sneaky opiate addiction. That's the one, is the lean. It's just, you sip it throughout the day, and it's the sneaky opiate addiction that you don't even realize you have, because you're not doing heroin. You're not buying it the same way or using it the same way. It's social heroin almost.
Right. Yeah. In hip hop, there's been a big glamorization of drugs like Xanax and these different pills, and no rapper would ever admit to shooting heroin.
Right.
And they don't talk about fentanyl, but the glamorization of the prescription pain pills is something that I don't think it's cool at all, and I don't think rappers should be doing it.
No, and unfortunately, a lot of the younger kids idolize these ones. Lil Peep, and even one of them's named after it, like Lil Xan. I mean, one of his songs was "Betrayed," which is about how the drugs betrayed him. But just that generation, that culture, they're talking about it, they're singing about it. It's just commonplace. But I was curious if that came up in your investigation, because that was where it's born, down in Houston, the Dirty South, and it's crept its way up here, and it's crept its way into mainstream music and media and television. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a really a great hip hop scene down there in Houston, and also wrote about like New Orleans, the Cash Money, No Limit, and in Atlanta, Outkast, and
I love Outkast.
So
Outkast is
fun,
Andre 3000 is amazing. Big Boy is too, but good
made
good
some
group.
of his best music while he was a drug-free vegan. So
isn't that amazing? So you don't need drugs to be creative, kids. Well, listen, I really want to thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. This was really interesting, and I know our listeners got a lot out of this, because again, they're just such an uninformed group sometimes when it comes to things like synthetics and fentanyl and what's actually happening to our country and our kids. So thank you for taking the time to join us. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Michael and Maureen. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And so we're going to make sure that we have links to all these things in the show notes as well. And hopefully maybe we'll have you back on at some other point when you've got another book out.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'd love to do it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ben.